Okay, so welcome. I'm very pleased today to have Armen Nurbekyan. Armen and I go back a very long time. I first met Armen. There's a wonderful story about this. I was working with the Central Bank of Armenia, developing a framework, what we call FPAS Mark One, and so on. And and they called me up and asked me to describe what the perfect person was that they should be looking to hire at the central bank. And I thought about all the people that I had worked with developing frameworks and doing macro research and so on. And I described this person. And then they called me up shortly afterwards saying that we found two of them. Would it be okay if they sent two of them instead of one? And I was quite surprised that they could even find one, but the idea that they could find two. Now, I never did understand where that other person was, but I wasn't disappointed with Armen Nurbekyan, who has been a wonderful collaborator on various projects when he was working with me in the research department of the IMF, and obviously developing the Outpass Mark One framework at the Central Bank of Armenia, along with a few other colleagues, importantly, Vazgen, who currently runs the macro directorate at the Central Bank of Armenia, and all of us agree that Vazgen played an enormous role in the development of what we're going to be talking about today. So Armen now is deputy governor at the Central Bank of Armenia, and so now he's going to be able to speak both as a policymaker as well as someone that was an economist that worked on developing and implementing the first generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems, and now more recently, the second generation. When I was at a recent conference in Korea, I was having dinner with governors, and Governor Waller pointed out that after you heard the story that I was telling you about New Zealand and F Passport too, he said, "Well, okay, this is the new New Zealand of monetary policy frameworks," and the reference there is obviously New Zealand. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand started it all in 1990 when they adopted a numerical target for inflation. And this this was a complete shock, especially to the central banking world, because when people at the IMF, for example, looked at what New Zealand was proposing, they thought there's no way that a central bank has the knowledge about how to think about the economy to start talking about setting inflation objectives. There was incredible skepticism and so on. I was at the Bank of Canada at the time, and unlike New Zealand, that was completely unprepared to do this. We had been working for years, me personally, on developing a framework to support flexible inflation targeting. So we announced inflation targeting second, and it wasn't because we developed a framework. That wasn't the reason. The reason was that we had a governor whose name was Governor John Crow that believed in price stability. So he wanted to go to zero, maybe with a little bit of measurement error, but he wanted to go to zero. And the government was about to give wage increases to public sector workers that would have embodied an inflation premium of 4%. So you can imagine, just for me to back up a little bit regarding the history of Canada, in the early 1980s, when we disinflated, the uh, the government was unprepared for that. And as a result, because we experienced a double-digit unemployment rate recession, we had the fiscal accounts blowout. Okay. And that was obviously a lack of coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, or you might view it that way. And so when we got to the 1990s and we wanted to reduce inflation to something low, we needed to pick a number. And so the number, in case you guys want to understand where two came from, was that it's zero, which is what the governor Crow wanted, and four, which is what was in existing people's expectations. So zero plus four divided by two is 2%. And so if you want to know where 2% came from, it eventually stuck and has become the standard and so on. Okay, so I now when Canada adopted inflation targeting, I've already told you that people were really skeptical of New Zealand doing this, but when Canada did it, ooh, Canada went to the G7 meetings after we adopted inflation targeting, and every one of the G7 members said that, you know, while it's okay for a little country like New Zealand to experiment with something as exotic as inflation targeting, was it really responsible for a G7 country like Canada to be doing this? So fast forward, that was 1990. It's now 2025. It's 35 years since the beginning of this story. And so the initial story was that New Zealand did it without really thinking about what it was doing. They picked a measure of inflation that had this really high and direct exchange rate weight, and then they used the interest rate to move the exchange rate to keep inflation in a narrow band. That ended up being extremely costly for the economy. And they learned their lesson. They developed what came to be known as a forecasting and policy analysis system. We call it Mark 1, where we think about the central bank's inflation forecast as being an ideal intermediate target. It's an ideal intermediate target in the sense that it was meant to be based on all available information that you would put into a baseline forecast, and that it would find a path for inflation back to the long run target in a way that efficiently managed the short run output inflation trade off. So that worked, I think, pretty well, but was never really tested. It was never really tested because we never really observed strong stagflationary shocks. And we always knew that until we had something like that, we would truly never test a monetary policy framework. COVID finally came along where we had some stagflationary shocks. We have some now, and there are some interesting parallels that one might draw between where we are right now and the summer of 2021, for example. Okay, but anyway, so uncertainty, that was what's missing, in this first generation. Too much emphasis on baselines and local approximations or linear models and so on. So anyway, I want to fast forward to today, where we have one very bold central bank that has jumped into the second generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems that attempts to deal with uncertainty and monetary policy making on uncertainty. So to start off the discussion, we have Vazgen. Vazgen was involved in both the development of the FPAS Mark II framework as well as the implementation. Over the last 6 months, he's been leading the six-person team. It only takes six people to do monetary policy. If you listen to the story in Armenia, that's quite a bit different than the way that I learned monetary policy when I was working at places like the Bank of Canada, where we had a lot of specialists and a lot of communication issues dealing with coordinating a large number of people. So one of the questions I want to ask Vazgen is why such small teams. Maybe he could comment on both the development of FPAS Mark II as well as the recent monetary policy report. I had the pleasure of spending a couple hours on Sunday working with Bob Ford. So Bob Ford is a bit of a legend. He was, first of all, my mentor. That's not why he's a legend, but he was a legend at the IMF and the OECD for his ability to be able to draft documents like the World Economic Outlook and also the flagship publication of the OECD. And we went through the recent monetary policy report from June that Vazgen was responsible for producing. And we went through it, kind of asking how could we improve this? And I was very pleasantly surprised that when we compared this document with other monetary policy reports, we could clearly see what the benefits were in terms of communication, in terms of providing coherent messaging and so on. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Vazgen, who's just finished his 6-month tour leading this group at the Central Bank of Armenia. And then afterwards, and in fact, when he's talking certain issues, I'll let maybe ask Armen to provide the policy perspective on the specific issue that he is discussing. Okay, Vazgen. My understanding is that this is your
Thanks.
third presentation of the day, so
Thanks, Doug.
let's hope this one is better than the first two.
Yeah, hopefully the every next one is better than the previous ones, hopefully. So thanks for this opportunity to speak uh, in this platform. So it's my pleasure always to be here. So about the first question, I remember like a couple of years ago when we first were discussing the new structure of our department and like the teams and so on. And we were discussing whether these six people are enough to do all this job, especially when we were going to enhance our communication tools, the all these documents, transparency, and so on. So that was really very, very challenging. And the first impression was that, that's not possible to do that with six member teams and so on. And produce all that stuff and publish all that stuff on the same day the decision is made bilingually. So that was very, very challenging at the first glance. But what was how the new structure is. Let me take a bit snapshot on that, and then I will also try to take the question from the other side. So the first thing what we changed in our department. So now we have four teams in our department, four teams consisting of six monetary policy experts. So these teams are rotating inside the department every quarter, ensuring that one team is responsible for the production round, another one is serving as a backup to the main production team, and the other two teams are in the development, the training and development process. So in this way, we are ensuring that all our economists are getting enough time both to be on kind of on the edge of the economic policy making, and both to have enough time for the training and development, and to enhance our analytical capabilities. So to write papers, to create some analytical tools, dashboards, and so on. But not only we are rotating inside the department, but also we are rotating inside the teams. So we employed this so-called generalistic approach. So every member of our team is required not only be good, for example, on inflation analysis, but also be good like analyzing the demand, the global economy. Doug talked about the specializations that most of the central banks have. For example, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we were also working on that manner. So we had a specialist on inflation, we had a specialist on the demand side of the economy, on the global external economy, and so on. But what we do now, we are now rotating the roles inside the team, ensuring that all the members of our teams are getting enough time and possibility to analyze like all the sectors of the economy, and they are required to do all the analysis. We usually compare it to the volleyball game. So there you also have a team of six members, and every time you win a point, so you rotate clockwise, and every player has to play at any point, at any position during the game. So they have to be good at like defending. They have to be good at offense. They have to like manage the game and so on. We also do this rotating in terms of the managerial skills. So, for example, during one quarter or so inside the team, one can be the coordinator or the leader of the team. But for example, the next round, another one may jump to the center, leading the role. So we are trying to prepare generalists. So we call them generalists. And this is one of the key answers to the question why that is possible, for example, to do with six-member teams, because like they are able to do everything like inside the team. So the adaptability and this generalist approach, the flexibility, I think are key to this, if we can call it success. So they complement each other inside the team. So every member is actually can work on any sector and cover everything there. So making possible to do all this job
So
by six
I think,
teams.
if I was listening to you, okay, and I might say this sounds like you've got a bunch of shallow people. They're all generalists. They can't really go very deep. And I think you really need to emphasize that when you're doing it this way, and uh, you have succeeded in creating four teams that spend a quarter doing this, that there's another 3 quarters of the year that can be devoted to human capital. So these generalists that you're talking about actually go much deeper than I think the average economist in even the advanced economy central bank. So I just want to say that our standards for how deep you go are actually much higher, even though we insist that if you're going to be involved in this operation, that you understand all of it and so on. So I just wanted to to make
Yeah,
sure that that the audience didn't get the impression that we were just
yeah.
going to shallowness and having a bunch of generalists that didn't know how to dig deeply into issues. But
Yeah,
okay,
that's
sorry.
that's really an absolutely like a fair question, and that was also a challenge, maybe one of the most important challenges to this structure and the HR strategy, one of the main ones. But how we try to solve that is that we employ the we call it like learning by doing. So every time they get some new tasks in real life situations, they have to undergo like all the processes to go to read some papers, like to do some deep analysis and so on. And usually, like the experience shows when they are doing all this in the real life situations, like rather than giving, for example, several months to any person to undergo a research, to understand, to go deeper. I think our experience showed that they do that really much more productively in less time than otherwise they might do. For example, if you let him alone, for example, going deeper into the economics and so on, it requires, I think, much more time than, for example, giving some specific task with some deadline and allowing to fail maybe sometimes, but they are learning much faster and I think even deeper than on the other case.
I would like to ask you a little bit about standards, okay? Because under this framework, the idea is that you have a practical issue. You can like you have to set realistic standards. Like you have like a workforce, you've got an existing human capital, we've got existing ways of training people and stuff. So you have a certain standard, but the goal is that over time those standards will grow. So could you please explain kind of how that works in Armenia? Because for many institutions, they will think that especially public sector institutions, they will think about that is what are the minimum standards, but the idea that the standards over time are expected to grow. Can you explain how that
Yeah.
actually works and how it is managed, please?
Yeah, the standards are really very high, and you already reflected on that. And I see that you liked our last report, the monetary policy report. And yes, I can say that over time, like people getting more and more experience, really getting into all of this, because the framework is also like new for us, not only like for you, for the general audience, but also like inside our team, the team members. We have lots of new members to our teams as they also get some experience really getting into the framework and this process and so on. So I observed that, for example, we did like two policy rounds, as you mentioned. Between the first and second monetary policy reports, I think the rising quality is obvious from my perspective. So yes, we are continuously trying to improve the standards.
So before you show us this great report, which is Bob and I thought it was amazing, we had three comments. Make it shorter. Okay, so we think we figured out reducing it by one page, but we compared it to all these other monetary policy reports. It already is way shorter, and there's way more substance uh, for the amount of space that's being used to talk about the issues that we advertised, which is about how do you think about policy making under uncertainty and so on. So the three comments were make it shorter, make the graphs intelligible, okay? which no monetary policy reports, according to our standards, satisfy. So there's just a couple of charts that we'd like to improve. And then at the very end, where you have the case A and case B scenario, we find that they're dangling. Like we got these dangling charts at the bottom. We just like to have something that sort of explains the assumptions. But that's just an example of feedback that you've got something that's I think is clearly the best of the best in the world, and we just want to make it better and better and better over time by by providing feedback. But could you please, we we recently had a very nice panel in Sintra where we had representatives from obviously Lagarde from the ECB, Chair Powell from the Fed, um, Governor Ree from the Bank of Korea. Um, uh, there was also the Bank of Japan that was represented. All these central banks are non-FPAS central banks. In other words, there's not one of them that actually made the investment like New Zealand and the Czech Republic and the Central Bank of Chile. The majority of small central banks actually that are doing flexible inflation targeting are doing FPAS Mark One, but not the advanced economy central banks. This is really interesting because the US, FPAS Mark II to a large extent, was developed on the intellectual framework that is actually applied inside the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. So I'm talking about inside Washington, D.C., the staff there have been providing this kind of scenario analysis for years, decades, but it has never been published. And in the latest minutes that were published last night, they devoted the first paragraph indicating that they may place more weight on all this wonderful scenario analysis that has a coherent set of scenarios. And when I mean coherent is that they have an interest rate path that's associated with every scenario for inflation and the real economy. That's what I mean by coherent. The non-FPAS central banks still have, market expectations of interest rates. They don't have a coherent framework to think about what do we need to do with our instruments and recognizing that it's not just the policy rate today, it's explaining monetary policy so that they can improve the efficiency and the efficacy of the monetary transmission mechanism for explaining to the public and to financial markets what they're likely to do in the future and so on. So maybe you could, you know, take us through the report. There were some other interesting points in the Sintra panel. One was Governor Bailey, where where he actually talked about least regrets policies and so on. And so maybe that is something that either you or Armen can also react to and so on. But please, if you could take us through the monetary policy report.
Yep.
I've already told you about my comments, but it's an amazing document. Okay, and congratulations on
Yeah.
achieving something that I think many central banks in the world can learn from.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug, for these kind words, but especially also thanks for the feedback. So we are, as I said, we are continuously working to improve this document and the standards and so on. And one direction that we are always working to trying to make the messaging and the charts better and better and more like speaking. And yes, let me briefly like go over the inflation or over the monetary policy report, like how it about its content, and maybe I can also like tell you in my opinion what is the main difference like between our monetary policy report and the other maybe like conventional styles of reporting. So, you know, over the last several years, the Central Bank of Armenia has undertaken like significant transformation in terms of how we make a decision, how we think about the monetary policy, and consequently, we changed the way how we report, how we communicate our policy to the general public. So the evolvement in the monetary policy report reflects these changes in our like policy making mindset, the approach, and so on. So briefly, our report has like three sections. The first and second one are, for example, in the first section, we have the executive monetary policy, executive statement on monetary policy, and the staff briefing about the current economic development. So this is generally like 2, 3 pages as a summary. Then we have the statements on long-term objectives and some one pager about our law, about our policy, about our framework, new framework. And then comes like the heart of our monetary policy report. This is the monetary policy outlook. And this is extremely different from what the other monetary policy reports are. So instead of employing instead of presenting a deterministic narrative about the economic developments, we put much emphasis on the risks and the sources of uncertainties that currently driving the economic developments. So our main emphasis are on the risks and uncertainties, which might not yet be priced by the financial markets, especially like those risks and sources of uncertainties or stemming scenarios and so on. Then we are like covering the global economy, the domestic economy, financial markets, labor market, like and so on. And then having this, so this is mainly answering like two main questions of the FPAS any FPAS like frameworks. So where the economy is now and what are the main driving forces are. And then we are concluding all these analyses with the comprehensive set of scenarios. So we pool all the scenarios that are stemming from these sources of uncertainties and risks. So I would say that this taxonomy of scenarios are maybe the most important part in our monetary policy report. So there we have all the scenarios that at least one board member is seriously concerned about and is thinking to manage the risks stemming from that scenarios. And so that's one of the most important changes or the transformations that we undertaken over the last several years. So this is not only like a scenario-based approach to monetary policy making, but this is also, I think, in my opinion, this is also going beyond that scenario-based approach. So this is also a shift or change in the economic mindset. And that's the essence of the least regrets policy. Maybe Armen might elaborate a bit more on that. But
I want to interrupt here, okay, and maybe draw Armen into this and so on, because just to be clear, okay, there is a section in the monetary policy report that has this taxonomy, qualitative, about all the different kinds of, well, four types of shocks that could be affecting the economy and pushing us into one of four regimes. One is like an excess demand regime, excess demand pressures, demand rises more than supply, inflation rises. One is the opposite of that. Those are what we call divine coincidence, or what Olivier Blanchard did, so it's a no-brainer what monetary policy needs to do, raise interest rates, because if the demand is too high and inflation is too high, they need to work on both those things. And then the more difficult quadrants, the most difficult, of course, being stagflationary environments where inflation's going up, and unfortunately you have to raise interest rates, the economy is weakening, and so on. So the reason I want to talk about that is that those are precisely the issues that are relevant today, with things like tariffs and a lot of the the shocks that we're facing are really the more difficult ones. So the reason I talk about this is that when we started off with that passport too, uh, we were working with David Archer and so on, and he was really pushing us to go back to the Teal book and look at all the scenarios that they produce. So in Jay Powell's recent communications, he talks about them now. Okay, doesn't talk about the details of what they actually produce, but he talks about the board staff producing around 6 or 7 different scenarios and stuff, right? And so this was kind of like about, remember we started the FS Mark II in October of 2022, and so this would have been early on in the process. And David Archer was actually suggesting that we needed all these lines, and so we went to experts that we considered to be really influential in developing FS Mark One, people like Thomas Phillip and Pablo Garcia and stuff, and said, "What do you think about publishing all these lines?" And they said that's just nuts. That would create such a communication disaster, because basically just people wouldn't be able to absorb any of this stuff. And so that's what gave rise to this idea in the monetary policy report that you would have this section that described what I thought. You described it a little bit differently than what I understood it. You gave me some new information today, which is good. Okay. What I always thought about that qualitative description of all the possibilities are looking what people care about, the stories, the narratives in financial markets, looking at the narrative of the staff, like what they think, and also thinking about the narrative of the board. Now, what you just said was that each one of these stories in this box, this qualitative stuff, at least one board member cares about it. So I found that kind of interesting. But the reason that I brought this up is that the Fed is in exactly that position now, because they produce, according to Chair Powell, 6 or 7 interesting scenarios, but they only publish them with a 5-year lag. And so they're in exactly the position we were in around late 2022, early 23. Okay, so the fact that we have actually discovered how to solve that problem, or one solution to that problem, I think is very interesting. But Armen, what do you think about this? What we're talking about?
Well, we know where to start. I think maybe if I go to Sintra first and then continue on the specific question. I thought the Sintra panel was very interesting, and there were 2 aspects for me which were interesting. Number one, if you look at the debate that we are having right now with the policymakers right now, it was very clear that during that panel, risk management and the scenario-based analysis was sort of in a central focus of the discussion for the top policymakers around the world. Whereas when we were actually talking about this 2.5 years ago, I think everybody thought we are sort of crazy. So I think, at least most of the people that I'm basically meeting who were telling that we're crazy, I think they sort of changed their attitude a bit. So I thought that change in 2.5 years, I thought was very, very interesting to observe. That's number one. That's on the positive side of things. Number two, I thought was interesting, and I was quite surprised actually. Like the very question that you could actually use scenarios as a public communication tool. Like how careful everybody was about it. I mean, I think, in one sense, yes, it's natural, but also it also introduced sort of this idea that there's so much inertia that even this very simple idea, in my opinion, which is kind of obvious because you couldn't think of even better times where scenarios could be helpful. Even that small steps are so difficult to do for these big central banks, because everybody was sort of saying yes, it's very important, but at the same time assuring that they are not going to deviate too much from what they're doing currently. So I thought it was interesting, even though, as you mentioned, I think Governor Bailey was. I think his remark on the least regrets was also very, very interesting. And they actually published, two scenarios, a couple of rounds ago, I think. Even though there are other things which we think that the Bank of England could, start with in terms of the structural analysis, but I thought it was very, very interesting. So these two aspects, sort of a good and bad, I thought was very, very interesting in the Sintra panel. Now, I think going to the discussion on the scenario-based analysis and what you were talking about and Vazgen was talking about in terms of the monetary policy report. For me, when I think about this framework, I don't like to think about something that we had to invent because it's just interesting. I think the point is really, how are the central banks making decisions, right? Before we go to any kind of technicalities, I think the real question is, how is the board of the central bank making a decision? And our hypothesis that we started, that really almost always, but especially during the uncertain times, it would be crazy to make a decision based on one line. So anybody who is sensible, they are most probably looking at the scenarios. And this is to your point, Doug, that Fed, in fact, when deciding on the monetary policy, in fact, there is lots of other information, including lots of scenarios that they are actually looking at, right, to make the decision. So if we are on board with this idea that, in fact, most of the central banks are making risk management considerations in their decision-making, now the next question comes, okay, how do you make it more operational so you don't have a mess in terms of the internal organizational process? That's one. And this is very much related to the discussion on the, having 6 people, doing the monetary policy analysis. We can talk about how the FPAS Mark II and scenario-based analysis actually, help in terms of organizing resources better. And there is a second question, which is related to the public and external communication, right? Because in fact, in my opinion, if, everybody is preaching that, they're so transparent, I think it's not that transparent actually to have a decision-making process which is very rich with lots of scenarios, but then to communicate one line. Because arguably, if you look at the current circumstances, especially, that one line, nobody knew at some point what will the tariffs be. So there was really a risk management approach to the things. So I think in that sense, it is probably also very natural that, in Armenia, this was sort of a higher relevance issue, because we're a small country. We face so much uncertainty if you look at the region. So it is something that we had to take into account in a more structural way. So that's basically the idea from our side. And now I thought your point on the taxonomy is really nice because uh, once you make that up in your mind that you want to actually have a good and transparent discussion with the market, which is more centered about the risk management, which is the real way if you are making decisions, then how do you make sure that you don't get into this trouble, as you said, Doug, about messing up with too many things going around? And so this is where during this discussion, I think it took us maybe several months to come to this idea. Now I don't even remember, how it happened, but this taxonomy of the scenarios was really, the solution, because what it does, it really boils down all this uncertainty into one simple table. And it makes very natural. So you just look at the table and you basically understand, these people who are making the decision, what are they really worried about, right? So I think that's why the taxonomy is so impactful, because it really, makes sure that you actually can put in an intelligible way, what are your worries. Going into our experience as a board of the central bank, I have to say what we learned also as a useful um, attribute of the taxonomy is that once you actually try to make it intelligible, because it's so important, you really start to think hard if what you are saying there is relevant, it is actually consistent or not, right? Because you don't want to have too much, you don't want to have a 5 pages of table, because everybody can come up with lots of things, but you really need to come up with things which are relevant, right? Which you can basically relate to something which is important in the real life. So that exercise itself, sort of keeping it compact, also in real life proves to be very, very important, because it makes board to sort of discuss in a hard way what is more important, to boil down to the real deep roots of the issues, and then write down what you have there. So I think in that sense taxonomy is a good way. And I think also what you will learn, Doug, if you look at the evolution of the reports that we have, you will basically see that there, it is becoming more focused, especially on the taxonomy part. When I look back, I think there is material improvement over there. So I think in that sense, it is extremely simple. Basically, if a central bank, wants to make a decision in a world of baseline scenarios, it's that central bank's decision, and then they absolutely should not do anything. They should not pretend to have fancy stuff. But in my opinion,
Can you hear me? Armen is frozen on my screen right now, but Sophie,
sorry, I think it was something with my internet. Where did you lose me?
okay. Sorry. You were saying something. You were saying a couple of really brilliant things, but can you kind of like rewind a little bit? Because you were on a roll and I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that, um, uh, it really boils down how the central bank, makes a decision. If a central bank makes a decision not based on a risk management approach, so if they prefer to discuss, for a week what's the most probable scenario, and then basically put all the eggs in one basket. That's their choice. They have the responsibility. But if the central bank does a risk management approach, which in my opinion is the only sensible way of making a decision. In fact, Doug, we can go into brain science. I'm happy to talk about that as well, because arguably, and there is something that I want to talk about because I was thinking about this today. But arguably, if you, there is a very nice book. It's called 1,000 Brains, which is I don't remember who is the author, but it basically argues that even the way that our minds and brains work, it's really our brains are constantly generating scenarios of what's coming. So the world and decision making is inherently probabilistic and scenario based. So that's the natural way of making decisions for human beings. So I think that's a very good point. And the based on that, I think the FPAS Mark II really makes it simple way of how do you incorporate this without actually making a mess. And one thing
Yeah,
which was
yeah.
I think one thing which is also very important, and I remember in 2022 we spent lots of time on this when we're talking about the Kahneman and others uh, in terms of adversarial collaboration. But one thing which goes back to your discussion with Vazgen, in terms of the, how do you put the scenarios? I think, based on my conversations with many people who, give us feedback on the framework, I think the very first sort of um, um, the natural reaction sort of to try to put some kind of a very scientific probabilities or these kind of things to the scenarios, right? And I thought this was very, but this thing I think we figured out very early on when we're talking about this framework, because the language that we use is very, very important, right? Because what we need to do is really to use a couple of words, likely, very likely, so you need just to need to give a couple of qualitative signals of how important is this or how costly do you think is policy errors, and it will really pass all the message that the market wants. You don't need to have these complicated numbers and going into this and pretend like you are doing something very scientific in terms of the probabilistic. So I think this was also very, very important, that the qualitative messaging and the was very, very important, and that's why what we use in the report and also in our public communication, it's not an accident. Every word is really thought about, and this qualitative communication is also quite important. So I think let me stop here, and if there are
Yeah,
any questions, I'm happy to elaborate, because I was a bit all over the place because the
yeah,
discussion
you
was so
were.
wide.
You were, in fact, you covered so much ground that I can't remember everything that you covered, but but I did want to talk about something. Um, when we developed FPAS Mark One, like in many central banks, and I just want to tell one little story about the Central Bank of Hungary governor and stuff. And I was there doing technical assistance, trying to teach them FPAS Mark One, and I came in with a plan saying that it took 2 years. That was the world record at that point. And he said, "Well, I have 3 years left on my term. I believe in investment and consumption. So I'll invest 18 months and then I can consume for 18 months. Do you think we could do that?" And I said, "Well, if you have coordination, between upper management, middle management, you get all the staff involved and so on. I could see that you could do this in 18 months." What's really fun about that story is that after they accomplished that goal of doing it in 18 months, I talked to him and he said, "Doug, you're not going to believe this. I actually felt that we had a meeting where we talked about monetary policy. We actually had a meeting where we had a framework to help us coordinate how we thought about monetary policy. Before that, he said we didn't really talk about monetary policy. So I've had a chance to experience that kind of excitement in the dynamic of an institution where after they develop this framework, it changes the way they think about things and so on. So we've talked a little bit about, the outputs like the monetary policy report and so on. But can you explain a little bit about the evolution? How does a board where you have individual accountability? Now you're not as big as the Fed, and you don't have the complex history of the Fed and so on. So you have a smaller number of people, but you still face this problem that you have to get them to agree on all of these things. You have to train the staff to be able to do it. Like the process surely must be dynamic. So maybe Armen, you could just talk a little bit about, what those dynamics have been. Like how did the improvement in the monetary policy report, like was it connected to the way that decision making and discussion happened at the central bank?
Yes, in fact, your comment about 18 months, in my experience, if you don't get things done in 18 months or 24 months, you're surely not going to make them done in
Yeah,
3 or 4 years. So I absolutely agree. I think this is also our common shared experience as well in all our previous work. So either you really do big things in a very specific time set, or you just basically drag. But other than that, now to go to your question. It is really, really important to understand that, all we are talking about is really a package. So it means if you want to do things in the right way, by the way, this is true for the F plus Mark 1 as well, but it's a bit more, I think, important for F plus Mark 2. So the components of package, contain internal organization, HR, communication internally, communications externally, which about monetary policy report and all that. And if you don't get one thing right, you're gonna screw up everything, right? And here everything happened, in parallel because this was work in progress. So let me actually sort of give you an idea how it happened, right? Because in the board of the central bank, depending on the structure, backgrounds, the way you choose the board members, you basically have, different board members with different temperaments, with different backgrounds. One board member is proficient in one thing, another board member is proficient in another thing, right? So in the case of central bank, we have, three executive board members, governor to deputy governors, and 5 non-executive board members, right? And so 8 people which have different backgrounds. So now, when we were trying to do this stuff in the beginning, obviously, it is quite scary, right? Because there were so many things that we were actually being afraid to do before, and now suddenly we jump into lots of transparency, scenario-based thinking, and all of that, right? So that is why we invested very heavily with the board, and I have to say, this has been a very big collective effort, very strong backing by the board. Their very courageous decisions, right, which made this happen. And so there was a very, very heavy investment into the knowledge and development of the framework. In fact, what happened? The board members they were there as a part of developers of the framework, because we had these kind of discussions. I think every couple of weeks the board members would come, to these meetings, and we would basically test some of the things on the board members. They would give us a feedback, and then they would present. So this was a learning exercise. And the most important thing, the reason I'm basically going to this, that the board really feels the ownership because they actually own this. This is really, really important. Now, if you own this thing, it means there is a mutual trust within the board and the staff, and you want to develop. Now, once you have this, the question comes, as you say, Doug, how do you combine the um, individual responsibilities, with this kind of a framework, right? First of all, I think if you ask that question in a baseline world, it's even worse, right? Because how do you make 8 people, agree on one line? This is impossible, which means that the most probably, most of the energy in that world is actually wasted on, fighting on that one line. But if you go through the process that I mentioned, which is basically explaining that what is important really is the qualitative assessment of the risks, associated taxonomy, and not the real nitty-gritty detail if it's 30% probability or 25% probability, then the mindset of the board really changes, because first, every board member in their individual one-pagers, which we have introduced, they still can actually put their view on. But the exercise of the case A and case B scenario-based exercise, that basically becomes a co-creation exercise rather than fighting each other over the baseline. So there's a very big transformation that we saw. So because in that case, you collectively want to tell different types of stories rather than marrying with one line. Now, in 2.5 years, Central Bank of Armenia went from the world that I was mentioning to a world that we publish attributed minutes the same day. Every board member publishes the same day in the transparency report their one-pager, which is again qualitative, gives an idea to the market. What are you thinking about? What's important for decision making? And we actually publish in both of these scenarios the paths for the exchange rate and monetary policy rate. Why am I mentioning the exchange rate monetary policy rate specifically? Because I want to illustrate to you that the things which were so difficult to do in small open economies before, right? So, if I went to the board and say, okay, let's publish the exchange rate path, 2.5 years ago, they would say, okay, you are crazy. Even though several countries in the world do it, but in a small open economies in our stage of development, it's very, very difficult. Now, from that world, we went to a world where we actually publish for the case A and case B, both interest rate and exchange rate had no problems. And it gives us a way of discussing, the most important things in the economy in a very transparent way. So I think this is the evolution and transformation that you do with the board. And, but obviously, it really depends on the decision making and governance of the central bank. So we are not that naive, but I think that's why we're trying to discuss the parts and the logic of the system, so you can actually look at your own central bank and try to understand how could you do it. So I think this FPAS Mark II is really important because it totally transforms the board from fighting over the baseline to a actually co-creation with a qualitative and good narrative. So I think in that sense, it really solves a big problem.
Okay, I want to give a chance, for if you want to ask a question to Armen or to Vazgen, just if you just like raise your hand and so on. I also so that was absolutely brilliant. Thanks for informing me. I sort of work for the Central Bank of Armenia, um, and uh, and so but I can't keep track of everything. So I learned a few things from both of you today, and so on. I wanted to also talk about AI, okay? Because I've been working on developing AI, talking to people about developing AI and applying it to optimize training in central banks. I think AI is probably the most dangerous thing that you could imagine. Now that now that I have a little bit of experience using it to try to train people, I think that it is making the economics profession and will make the economics profession dumber and dumber, and the standards will get lower and lower unless very proactive um, action is taken to figure out what the fundamental problems are and to regulate it in a way that incentivizes people. So I think in terms of central banks, what it means is extremely high levels of transparency and accountability where we can see the inputs closed. This is obviously closed AI, secure AI. Well, as secure as closed AI can be, in the sense that you have to totally trust the developer that they haven't hidden something in the software and so on. So that's why you need to think of this as a public good. Any closed software has that risk of not being completely secure and so on. But but the implication, I think, of my thinking, and this is really obviously evolving very rapidly, is that we will need maximum transparency. In other words, we will need people to talk into the uh, into into the box, the input box, and we'll need to see how they respond to the AI, and we'll need to see how it iterates, and we will need to evaluate all of that. Otherwise, we are destined to to basically lose control of all quality in areas like monetary policy, where judgment and machines just don't work very well. But Armen, maybe you could talk about your views. Vazgen, you're happy to engage in this. The audience is also, we invite you to engage in these issues or ask questions, make comments, or whatever. But those are my views, Armen. Maybe you could take the first stab. Are you as paranoid as I am about AI?
I think I mostly agree with what you said, and we were discussing this. I think in January during the workshop. But when we're discussing with Kush about the responsible AI, the first point which you talked about, and I agree, I think this is the common property of powerful tools. Powerful tools can do lots of good and then lots of bad. This is true in, if you think about nuclear weapons or whatever, right? So in that sense, AI is certainly a very powerful tool which can make lots of good and then lots of bad, right? So that's why you really need to have a responsible AI, which means that you need to control these risks, or it can do a lots of bad. So I think I'm all there. Now, if you think about the uh, about generally AI, I think the in education system 100%, AI was not really, I think, designed for education system. So people who were actually designing AI, they have not thought about, how it would apply to schools. So what I'm most worried about, Doug, is not really about the economist profession, but about really schools and kids, yeah, because if you expose them to AI too soon, uh, before they actually get, sound thinking, ask questions, that can be very, very dangerous. So I'm more worried about AI in, putting it responsibly in the education system school. So that's what I'm most worried about. In the central banks, I think the way I like to think about the AI think there's lots of potential, but again, there's lots of downside. And the way I like to think about is if you try to think about, four quadrants. On the horizontal axis, put, the experience of a person. Okay? On the vertical axis, put the energy level of a person. And then you get 4 quadrants. If you put the AI in the hands of an experienced and highly energetic person, it is going to multiply productivity by 100 times. So that's no-brainer. That's easy. On the low experience, low energy, you need old style schooling, which is basically motivating a person, asking a question, and doing lots of hand holding. All right, so I think that part is also, is also quite clear, right? If you have a high experience, person, but with low energy, these are kind of people who don't want to embrace new tools, right? So for these people, you probably need some kind of an introduction, giving them expose them somehow, to show them, and they will, arguably over time, they would see that their experience can make them lots of good. On the quadrant where you have high energy but low experience, this is also very dangerous because these people actually will start using AI very actively, do lots of stupid stuff, and then, they actually contaminate the system and they may think that they're very, very good at something. In fact, they have no idea. So in my mind, when you think about, handling the issues responsibly within the central bank, is really thinking about this in some kind of a structured way like this, and then, attending to people, according to this. So this is my take. And I think, this is kind of a way that maybe naturally we were doing this in the, our training, right? Because we would torture people, mostly you. Yeah, we would torture people in terms of, making them do really boring stuff with high standards, right? So they get more experience because person has to understand, that the standards are not negotiable. That, if you cannot hold up the standards for a simple stuff, none of the AI is gonna make you, make the problem solve. It's an issue of a, discipline and kind of stuff, right? But then over time, when we have more experienced people, when we actually put more pressure on them to, use AI and all that. So that's how I think about this in terms of the central banks. I think. And not only central banks, I think pretty much everywhere. I think you sort of need to attend to these 4 different groups, in this way. But see, the interesting thing about this, quadrants is that it really also shows you how stupid mistake can you make, right? Because if you sort of do the wrong thing in the wrong quadrant, it can really create in a disaster. Think about a guy or a girl, which has no idea about what is a GDP or, about simple economics, but can generate tons of NAS reports. And then this person goes to the board. Think about type of a disaster it can actually come up, right? Disaster type number 1, after the first question, everybody realizes this person has no idea about policy, has never thought about any issue deeply. It's just, nice, pictures. The problem even worse, that even board cannot, distill this. And then there is a collective stupidity. I'm sorry for being too blunt, but I think this is a real danger, yes. So I think, responsible, AI is really, really important. At the same time, if you sort of put things in the right quadrant, I think it can really multiply the productivity level. That's my take.
Yeah, I remember. Sorry, you jolted my mind there a little bit. I remember when it was first presenting to the basically upper management at the Bank of Canada, and one of the deputy governors came up to me afterwards and said, "When you actually figure out something that makes sense, write me a memo." Uh, so so having this kind of direct feedback.
That
No,
was a
him and
that
I
was a
actually
very
ended
tough
up.
feedback, but probably, very useful lesson. Yeah.
So he ended up being my co-author on a number of papers. His name is Chuck Friedman and stuff, right?
Yes, I know
And
him. Yeah.
and after writing a whole bunch of papers, and I taught him latex, okay, on the weekend. We were stuck in a snowstorm in Ottawa and stuff. And I taught him latex. He was like, almost 70 and stuff. And he says, now I'm going to have real credibility with my kids, that are studying physics and blah, 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 because, basically I can, so I like the idea of older, experienced people, because, I feel, God, I wish I was younger. I wish I wish I was at the beginning of my, my work career now, because if I had the experience, if I would have been 20 and had the experience that I have now, my heavens, what could be achieved, because the AI would replace a lot of the stuff,
Yeah.
especially the stress, especially
Yes.
like the stress. I was talking to Don Coletti about this, uh, and we were talking about all the stupid stuff that we had to do, just correcting punctuation and making sure that documents were extremely professional and stuff like that. Going over numerous drafts of documents and being responsible for that wears you down. And so that kind of stress now with AI is to a large extent eliminated. You create these darn standards and it is double checking. So it can be used very, very productively if it's in the hands of experienced people. But if you put it in the hands of inexperienced people that are just asking you, what is the answer to this question? and and it can generate now stuff that looks
Yeah.
very professional to them. And if they pass it to someone that also doesn't understand anything, it will look very professional to them as well. And it will basically just be a bunch of nonsense that is copied, and where we lose all sense of truth and judgment about important matters and so on. So I think we agree. I noticed that Nark is there, but is there anyone that has any questions or comments? Uh, Vazgen, I kind of cut you off there. I'm so sorry about that. Like, did you want to add something, Vazgen? Because
No,
uh,
I was just enjoying this discussion so about all this stuff. The only thing or the only risk I may add up as like added value to this discussion, maybe that, the last time we were also discussing and talking about all these issues, the AI, the responsible AI, and so on. I was saying that, maybe my generation and the older generations are getting much more benefits of these AI tools, because like they are using this really as a tool, because they have gained and accumulated the knowledge, like experience and so on, and they treat it as a tool. But that's a really, that may become a trap for younger generations if they treat it as a teacher, and if they like, yes, so that the heavy use of these AI tools may block them from gaining the experience, so that they can start to treat them as a tool. So that's really, really very important to try to do lots of things by themselves and to gain that experience, to be tortured and not be afraid of the torture. Yes.
so so Armen, I just wanted to adjust your theory about the four quadrants a little bit, and you'll be very, very happy to know that the curves can shift. Okay, that there are some factors that can cause shifts in the curves, and so the story that I'm telling is that in the profession, AI will infect us negatively. Okay, but I can happily report that the students that we've been getting, and I think the reason is that because you're doing something exciting and interesting, we're actually attracting, even though the general quality in the overall economics profession might be going down, I think it's still true that that for those people that do interesting things, where people feel like they're a part of, social responsibility and so on. I think, there's that can shift your curves. So the way I think about it, I love your theory, but it'd be nice to have kind of like a time dimension to it. You're really trying to find people that that love to invest in human capital effectively, that get utility from things like that. And those are going to end up being the people that have the passion to do these things. And, obviously, and on the question of the experience, that I think with AI we can learn so much faster. Partly because of that pass mark too. Like you eliminate the folly in things, and you end up focusing, more on important and substantive issues, and you stop wasting your time on doing nonsensical activities and so on. So there's some potential benefits. But Nora, please.
Uh, so first of all, thank you for organizing this great discussion. And let me start with adding a few words on AI. So monetary policy is a sub-branch of information industry. And information is becoming wider, and the format of available information is changing. We used to deal with time series data, cross-sectional data. Now the format of information is much wider, and the information is much larger. So there is an immense potential for the use of AI, but as mentioned, AI must be used by professionals. Otherwise, adverse effects can happen. So it's a powerful tool, as Armen mentioned, and AI must be used by professionals. So looking into the future, a typical economist will invest his time and resources in other areas, rather than making himself or herself very skillful in producing charts and presentations. They will invest in knowledge, in reading, in reading a lot of seminal papers and mastering the concepts. So this is my vision about a typical economist profile change in the future. So resources will be used more efficiently. So this is on AI. Briefly, I see a huge potential, but people has a definite role in here, and people must be very much more trained in certain areas of economics compared to today, to be able to make maximum out of the AI. But coming back to the first part of our discussions, the pillars of FPAS Mark II, I agree with all the concepts and expressed during this discussion, and I would emphasize especially the communication part, because communication makes you responsible, it makes you be transparent, especially individual communication by the board members makes each board member extremely responsible. Well, at the end of the day, human species are motivated by egoistic forces, correct? So ego is in the center. So although board is a collective body, I am convinced that this individual responsibility that we put on board members makes board much more efficient collective body at the end of the day, because each board member must be very transparent in his stories, scenarios. This must comply with the 3 Rs. This must be reasonable, relevant, and data-driven and have impact. So communication makes you really operative, and the framework as a whole must be really brilliant, so that both individual and collectively the board is not ashamed and is not afraid to open up to the public. So this is huge responsibility, huge work, which at the end of the day benefits. This was another opinion. And then I have a question which has a motive to discuss things from another angle. I want to go a bit into the technicalities and use technical language in our discussion. And my question is about the regime change and the effects on inflation and the interest rate variability. So if we assume that FPAS Mark II is a regime changer, and we have the world before the FPAS Mark II and after the FPAS Mark II, and on a typical economy, if we change the regime, so question number one, do we expect the inflation to be more stable in the future? After all this great discussion, the great virtues that FPAS Mark II delivers, at the end of the day, does it, if implemented successfully, does it guarantee more stable inflation, more better price stability at the end of the day? And if so, in the long run, interest rate variability will be less because you have to do less work because of high credibility. However, in the short term, in the transition period, a question arises, maybe the interest rates and central bank actions must be more aggressive or less aggressive. So on our way to achieve this price stability, should we be more flexible in this scenario world, or we will be more cautious? So question about interest rate and the inflation variability after the regime change in the short run and in the long run.
So you know what this means, is I'm really excited because it sounds like a PhD thesis, Armen and Vazgen. If you guys can come up with a reasonable way of thinking about the answer to his question, this is a PhD thesis. Okay, just for the some of the people that have joined us and so on. So who wants to go first, Armen or Vazgen? Who wants to have the first crack at this wonderful question? About how this will change. You might say that when risks are underpriced, because of the Fed's regime. For example, the problem I have with it, for example, during COVID, or I can even go back to 2009. 2009, the expected path of the Fed funds rate was expected to rise in a way that was not consistent with them having double-digit unemployment and inflation below the target. And if you go back to the Teal book that talks about the scenarios that were being presented to the FOMC, it was suggesting that they should communicate that the Fed funds rate should be at the effective lower bound for years. In other words, that they needed way more stimulus to escape, and of course they didn't escape it for years and years and years and so on, right? So I like that's the way I would be thinking. But Armen, Vazgen, please. It seems like there's a PhD thesis if in the answer to this question.
It's a difficult. Vazgen, go first. Then I will.
Okay.
Poor Vazgen. Vazgen's being tested right now.
No.
This is all you guys have come to a seminar, but really it's just a test of Vazgen to see whether I can make it from level 1 to level 2. Okay, this is how we operate in the global forecasting school. We put pressure on these poor guys. Okay, Vazgen.
Yeah, that's a really very tough question to address. So especially that's a very tough question when trying to answer like that question conceptually, not having like some analysis or quantitative research behind that. But what I believe is that the monetary policy is to create a volatility, for example, in the near term or in the short term, to deliver a long-term stability or long-term stable macro environment in the future or in the long term or in the medium term. So even if we come up with a situation that we are creating a bit more volatility in the near term, operating with this framework, I mean a bit more volatility like in the short term interest rates or in inflation, but the long term inflation is better anchored and we deliver a more stable long term macro environment. I think even in that case, I am okay with that. But on the other side, I think that, gaining credibility, so this transparency, that accountability that we employed, I think will help us gain much more credibility from the financial markets, which will allow us to achieve our goals with lower variability in the interest rates. So I believe that that is also another very important channel which will also help us have even a lower variability in the short term now.
Yeah, so I think this is like a really, Armen, before you start, it's a really fundamental question because if the Fed, for example, takes on all this risk, okay, for example, stimulating, during the global financial crisis or stimulating during COVID and so on. And if that involves, according to, to achieve level one, you have to understand endogenous money creation. And once you understand that, you understand the potential risk to financial stability of really stimulating the economy, driving real interest rates in COVID down to negative numbers. Mortgage 30, like long-term mortgages, 30-year mortgages were below 3%. Like just think about that. Like, that commercial banks put that stuff on their balance sheets and they put government securities on their balance sheets that had these really low interest rates. That's extremely dangerous. Like equity prices doubled during a period where we were supposed to be producing less output and so on. So if you think that there's a bubble in equity markets that could, in fact, Jay Powell, I've been following his comments very closely. He's finally brought financial stability into his comments. It's not just the dual mandate of inflation and output, or sorry, inflation and employment, but he's added financial stability to to his comments. So at least I think there's a bit of a recognition there that we could be sitting on top of a gigantic asset price bubble. But the question of Armen and possibly Dark too is how much can you talk about things like asset price bubbles, aside from maybe mentioning the term financial stability and so on. But I love your question, Nark. I think it's very fundamental, but I'd like to hear what Armen has to say about it.
I think if you think about inflation, I almost like to think about inflation as a sort of a policy preference. So I would say, that you wouldn't expect much of a difference in the inflation because basically you would basically do to see what's happening with the interest rate to deliver the same inflation outcomes in some way, right? So I wouldn't say that inflation outcomes would be very, very different. Now the interest rate story is very, very interesting, right? And I think this is a very, very good question because it really goes into the real heart of the FPAS Mark II. And here's why. The real difference in the interest rate decision making in the FPAS Mark II and FPAS Mark I, in terms of the variation comes where you actually, at some point, where some average or medium or median scenario can produce certain results for your interest rate decision making. But for example, you are close to these dark corners or some kind of nonlinearities where there could be a very, very big, change in your decision making, right? What it means that, in the scenario-based world, if you are close to the scary outcomes, in the FPAS Mark II, you actually react, much more aggressively just to keep away from the scary outcomes. So I think this is really where it makes the difference with the interest rate decision making, right? Because in a baseline scenario world, for example, as Doug mentioned about financial stability, and if you have that kind of a concerns, extremely difficult to make a monetary policy decision because this is something which you care about. But you cannot talk about in a structural way, right? So in that sense, I think, in the short run, at least I agree with Vazgen, it would, you would basically react in many cases, a bit sharper compared to the FPAS Mark I because you just want to keep away from this dark, and this is by design. So I think in that sense, that's important. Now, in going forward, it really depends where you think you are. Right now, if you think that there are more, kind of a shocks that are going to be around the non-linearities, I think arguably yes, if you look at the public debt around the world, we are, I think, at the places where we can see lots of variations in the scenario-based world. So my take would be, at least in the short run, I think, and this was the interest rate will be a bit more volatile because of that. Now, I think, relating this to a question that Doug asked, and really, I think, showing the real importance of FPAS Mark II. I won't mention name of the central banks, but there were actually central banks which were making their monetary policy decisions, very developed central banks, which were making their monetary policy decisions based on the concerns about, for example, housing prices, as Doug mentioned. And these were developed at very transparent central banks. Now, because they didn't have this, structural way of decision making, when you go and look at these scenarios, what they were publishing, you would see that these were the moments where these central banks would actually they were not, let's say, decreasing the interest rates because they were concerned about some kind of asset prices, but at the same time, they couldn't talk about it because they were constrained about this baseline and all of that. So they had this big communication challenge where you have this, real action that you want to do in terms of monetary policy, but at the same time, you have totally different thing in your mind. I don't want to mention names, but there is a, very prominent central bank which comes to my mind. And this part, when you go and look at the minutes of the central bank, go and look at the scenarios, you would see that these were the points where there was this contradiction, because at that point they really wanted to make a scenario-based decision making, as Doug mentioned, for example, because of the asset prices. But they had to put it in there, this baseline framework. So it inherently, if you look at it closer, you can see that there was a bit of a mess in terms of the communication and the underlying assets. So I think this, it's much better if this is something, everybody agrees. I think if you can separate things, financial stability, monetary policy, whatever, yes, it's better to have separated. But also, I think everybody agrees that there are times it's kind of, impossible to separate. And I think in that cases, you better have a consistent way of communicating that rather than sort of putting it under the rug. That's my take. This was the case during the SVB crisis. during the tariffs and all of that.
I don't get to talk to Armen very much because he's so damn busy, but today he seems to be, got lots of time and Narc, you
Yeah.
too, and so. But uh, I'm writing a paper right now, Armen, okay? And the basic idea is that when you're a small open economy, that and you're in a situation you're concerned about financial stability and don't want to reduce the interest rate down to really, really, really low levels, you don't really have to worry about that because you always have an FX intervention strategy that can depreciate the exchange rate. So you just don't have to worry about getting stuck in low inflation traps and stuff like that. Um, so, so I think the open economy is quite a bit. I mean, the examples in open economies are quite a bit different than the advanced economies where they have to be concerned about the effect of lower bound because
But
they,
see, I agree with you 100%. But see, in the case that I mentioned, there was a small open economy where because the housing prices were high, they were worried that if they reduce the interest rates, they would actually put more pressure on the housing prices. So I think what you are saying is interesting. If you can basically sort of try to tweak with the FX intervention, but I think even in the small open economies you can still have this problem. And so the question is really there. If you have these concerns and you are close to the nonlinearities, how are you going to communicate this to
no, the
the
problems,
public?
no,
Yeah.
what I'm arguing is the problems are even worse
Yes. Yeah.
in small
Yeah.
vulnerable
Yeah.
economies, and that's why you want to set maybe your effective lower bound. So you might even want 2 or 3% for short-term interest rates. And what I'm arguing is that don't worry about that because you have not. I wouldn't describe it as FX interventions. I would say an FX intervention strategy
Yeah.
that communicates that you're prepared to depreciate and you have the exchange rate to do it. And it should be super credible if you have a really good framework and you've communicated it. The check showed this. It could be improved. I'm talking about November 7th, 2013. But it could be improved, developing the analytical framework. So anyway, I'm working interestingly with the Asians, because the great mystery is that they are the central banks that didn't cut interest rates because they were concerned about financial stability, but things worked out. In other words, the exchange rate, and so you might ask, well, maybe that's because if they're rational and they understand that there's a fundamental asymmetry there, that central banks can always depreciate. They always can't appreciate, but they can always depreciate. And if you understand it, the central bank understands that. The board of the central bank understands that. The board has the legal authority to purchase unlimited amounts of foreign assets. They don't have to purchase anyone because you'd have to be a complete fool if you believe that it was in the interest of the central bank to to generate that inflation. Okay, then obviously if they have the legal authority to purchase unlimited foreign assets, it should be super credible and so on. So and if it's not credible, you accumulate some foreign assets. So they go with what's the big deal and so on. So that's what's fundamentally different from a little open economy where you have competent central bankers and you have an institutional framework that kind of understands this, than from your advanced economy, the US and the euro area where it's more difficult to say that we can depreciate our currency to get out of that kind of downside uh, dark corner, where you get stuck in a low inflation trap like the euro area got stuck in effectively from the global financial crisis all the way up until before COVID. They were inflation, longer term inflation expectations were systematically below 2%. So, I mean, they barely got up to 1.5% and so on. So anyway, we've gone way over time. Thank you, Vazgen, Armen, Narek. I found it very stimulating, and I've written down a bunch of notes, and so that I think that I'll have to review the notes and try to figure out what I learned today. But it was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure. Thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah, thank
See
you
you.
for this presentation.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.